So what if the complaint is against the chairman of the company?
Yes.
What if it is a sexual assault complaint? Let's just use that as an awful example. But after the Me Too movement, this is something we talk about more, which is a good thing. So that is very hard. How does an HR person who gets landed with this proceed, right? This is very dangerous territory. They may have a fabulous relationship with the CEO, or they may have a terrible relationship. And how do you stay proactive in such a tenuous situation?
Welcome to MetaGagement, the HR show that dives deep into the heart of employee engagement and workplace culture. Your hosts, Ann Scottlin and Dr. Lyman Montgomery, bring you a groundbreaking show that explores innovative strategies and insights to transform and elevate your organization's HR practices. Dr. Montgomery is an employee engagement expert and best-selling author, while Ann Scottlin is an acclaimed business consultant and podcaster. Together, they will unpack the complexities of modern HR challenges and reveal innovative solutions that can be immediately applied to your workplace. Please welcome Ann Scottlin and Dr. Lyman Montgomery.
Welcome back to MetaGagement-HR. This is your go-to podcast for cutting-edge human resources strategies. I'm Ann Scottlin alongside the Dr. Lyman Montgomery. How are you, Dr. Lyman?
Hey, I'm doing great. And yourself?
I am good. I'm so thrilled to be here today and also to share another episode in this series on conducting workplace investigations. And today's topic, gathering the facts, which I think is so useful, collecting evidence, evidence collection and analysis. This is really crucial to leading to fair and accurate conclusions. Why is that so important?
Well, I think it's important, number one, to make sure that you have the true story. A lot of times when it comes to workplace investigations, it can be scattered. You got different versions of the truth. It's almost like the old saying, if 3 people see an accident, you'll end up with 6 versions of that accident. And so you want to make sure you gather all of the facts, the what, the where, the how, sometimes the why, not always, but you want to make sure that you do your due diligence in making sure you have as much facts as you can gather initially.
So true. And today we're going to cover everything from types of evidence that you should be collecting to how to analyze it effectively. So for all of those of you tuning in today, watching or listening, thanks again for being with us here on MetaGagement. Please like and subscribe. Shoot us your questions. We're thrilled to have you, and we always like to hear from you. So with that said, let's jump straight in to evidence collection and analysis. Let's start with types of evidence and how to collect them. So if I list here several kinds of evidence, and then we can go into it, of course,
Yes.
We have physical evidence, we have testimonial evidence, we have preserving evidence?
Right. That's where you basically want to make sure that when you preserve evidence, that you have what they call chain of custody. You also have what's called digital evidence, where electronic surveillance, tape recording, companies may have a policy where they can look at your computer where you've gone, looking at the history on your browser history. Even if the company has, for example, cell phones, they can look at your cell phone records to also discover if there were text messages or voice messages. And this, again, if it's a company phone. So
Perfect.
Yes, physical evidence is basically where it's something physical, like a cell phone that maybe you can look at. Digital being more of stuff that's in the cloud. And again, this pertains to laptops, company-owned cell phones, tablets. It could also be your computer server as a digital footprint that they can look at.
Absolutely. So this is a great sampling of the different varieties. I think I just thought I had read a typo there. I was like, am I speaking Greek here? What's happening? It's like, I love it when that happens. I have my own set of bloopers now. So let's start digging in just briefly here to the documents and records specifically. What do we want to look for, and how do we gather that relevant documentation before we even get to the other evidence?
Yeah, let's start with like physical evidence. Let's say, for example, there was a violent or threatening behavior where a person threw a mug at someone. That mug that was thrown at a coworker in a bit of rage or fit of rage would be an example of physical evidence. Another example, when you're looking for physical evidence, maybe they wrote a note that said, hey, if you tell on me, I'm going to make sure you get fired. That note is physical evidence. So anything that you can physically touch is considered physical evidence. It could be clothing. It can be, like I said, an object that was thrown. It could be property that was destroyed. Let's say you're in the break room and someone gets mad and they, kick the trash can. That trash can is now dented up, but still university, or let's say the workplace property. That's considered physical evidence. And you want to make sure that you secure that in a safe location because it could come up in, let's say, a criminal investigation. So you want to make sure that you secure the physical evidence that you've gathered in the course of your investigation.
Perfect. And then we have to really be careful of our witness statements, of corroborating testimonies. Testimonial evidence is tremendously important. And in this case, we're still talking about, at this point, still in-office practices, or even the third-party consulting in office.
That is correct. Especially, I like what you said, as far as when it comes to witness statement, you want to make sure that not only you capture the witness statement, but what I like to do is make sure the witness reads and sign and to attest that, yes, the information that's been gathered is correct. Oftentimes, you will have a witness give a statement either verbally. It's better to have them write a statement out. But let's say you're dealing with someone that's highly emotional, they're upset, and they might say, give me a couple of days. Well, you don't have a couple of days. In cases where the person is unable to write out a statement, then it's best that you take their statement, have them give it verbally, and you transcribe it, but then make sure that the witness have an opportunity to read over it, make sure that you've captured everything correctly. And here's something that most people forget, Ann: sign and date it. I have seen a number of witness statements that are signed, but there's no date. And it's kind of hard to go back and say, I think it was on. That's when you see them say, on or about. That's because you don't have a date. You want to make sure you have a date.
Well, I mean, and that's kind of, Detective 101, if any countries out there in the fantasy world of TV detection, right? You got to have your witness statements signed and dated, and not delay on witness statements as much as possible before there can be literally, even if we're not, depends on whether we're talking criminal or just internal issues, basically witness tampering, people being bribed or threatened. You need to get those accounts as soon as you possibly can before they can. And also, people just forget. The longer the time passes, often the accuracy is compromised.
Yeah, that is true. That is so true. You bring up an interesting point. Right now in the media, there's a huge legal case going on. And this one, I won't say the name, but this one very high powerful individual in the music industry was denied bail in part because they found out that this individual had contacted a potential witness over 50 times. They called this potential witness in an investigation over 50 times. That in and of itself can be deemed as witness tampering or interfering with an investigation. And so it's very important that, let's say, the person being accused, that you let the person know not to have any contact with anyone as long as this case is going on, because it could be viewed as retaliatory, especially against witnesses. And we're seeing that played out right now in the media, where an individual contacted a potential witness, I believe over 50 times in a day. And that's a bit excessive.
That's astonishing.
Very good point that you raised.
60 times.
Yes.
And And then preserving evidence, like, and we've already talked about different kinds of evidence, and we'll talk a little bit more like digital and data. But even if your people in your team are filing a complaint, you want them to preserve the evidence too, whether it turns out to be useful or not. I remember back in the day, my father being on awkward sides of pro and anti-union factions within production plant, right? So that was a huge issue when people were leaving notes and puncturing tires or vice versa, whatever was going down. This is a really big deal. And, you can't just take people's word for it. So how do you, some of the stories he told me about his friends were pretty intense. I'm like, okay, there might not have been a lot of recourse back then, but now there is. And that's part of the reason why we want to keep this evidence preserved.
Yeah. And that's huge. And making sure that the evidence that's collected, whether that's witness statements, whether it's physical evidence, that it is in a secure location, whether that's being an office, a lockbox, depending on the size of the evidence gathered. You want to make sure that you limit the scope of individuals having access to the evidence. For example, the person collecting the evidence, there should be what's called a chain of custody form. What that means is every person that touches that piece of evidence, there should be a date, a signature, as well as a timestamp. For example, let's say I was the person who collected the mug that had been thrown. I'm going to place that mug maybe in a plastic bag or something, like a Ziploc bag. On that Ziploc bag, I'm going to put the date, maybe what's in there, and I'm going to sign my name or initial, and I'm going to put a time that it was collected. So when, let's say 2 or 3 weeks from now, when I'm doing my final report, I can say and look at that and say, oh, mug was collected in the break room, left side of the break room next to the counter or something like that, collected by Lyman Montgomery, date, and the time. And so now I have a complete record of all the evidence that's been collected in case it's challenged. Because when you have a break in that chain of custody, this is where things can go awry. I say, well, wait a minute. You said you collected the mug on Monday, but the report says Thursday. So when was it? So you want to make sure that your dates match.
Yes, and if it is documents, as you suggest, having a cover sheet where anyone who is permitted to see it has to sign and date it before they're even allowed to open a file, so that it's absolutely clear and there's no question who has and hasn't been tampering or observing the contents.
Right, and that's important because if you limit the scope of the individuals that have access, let's say you only have 2 or 3 people, then the more tighter that circle is, the less discrepancies you have because you've been able to secure it, preserve the evidence, and only 2 or 3 people had access to it. Now, even let's say you have 2 or 3 people that have access, whenever evidence is taken out, let's say of an evidence room, or some people call a evidence file, if you don't have a room, you want to make sure that there's also a transmittal that says, oh, removed evidence from the locker or from the cabinet or the file to do a report, and the timestamp again. So whenever you touch it, you want to make sure there's documentation that corroborates the individual by name, time, date. And so we know whenever that information was handled, who handled it, what time they handled it, and the date that it was handled.
That's perfect. And when we come back from this commercial break, we're actually going to then go to part 2. So analyzing and evaluating all this evidence that has been collected. Now, what do we do it? We have it. Now, what do we do with it? That's the big question. So we're going to run to commercial break. When we come back, please stay tuned. We're going to be talking about that. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, share this link with a friend who would love this content, and we'll see you back here in a moment.
Are you ready to elevate your team and organizational effectiveness? Dive into the focused Meta Mindset 5 Persona Types Architecture Assessment and discover your unique superpower as a leader or team member. Whether you're a fearless cheerleader, diligent construction worker, calculating chess player, commanding commander, or analytical chemist, this journey of self-discovery will highlight your strengths, sharpen your focus, and propel you towards success. This isn't just a quiz, it's your pathway to unlocking and embracing the potential that will transform your organization. Ready to find out your persona type? Head over to MetaGagement.com to take the assessment now.
All right, welcome back to MetaGagement, the program for HR professionals and made by HR professionals. And we are in part 3 of 4 in our series, Making the Possible Probable, particularly helping conduct workplace investigations. And this is our episode 3. And today we're talking about gathering the facts, evidence collection and analysis, how important all of this is. And we're turning now specifically into staying objective in analysis. So Lyman, tell us a little bit about how do we avoid bias? How do we weigh that evidence?
Yeah, all of us have biases, okay? The most common type of biases that you see when it comes to investigation, and I just deal with 2 of them. There are plenty of them, but I just deal with 2 of the most common. One is called recency, and the other is called negative bias. A recency bias is whatever was done most recent, we tend to remember. For example, if a person, let's say the person under investigation, I had a real good experience. Like, well, you know what? That couldn't be John. I just had lunch with him. John appeared to be a nice person. Well, you're biased because you're going off of the most recent interaction that you had with John. Let's say, for example, it was a negative interaction. You know what? There was always something suspicious about John. I had lunch with John. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He seemed like he was hiding something. Yeah, he probably did it. So that's an example of a recency bias. A negative bias simply says we tend to hold on things that are negative more so than things that are positive. Look at the news. You know, there's an old saying in news that said, if it bleeds, it leads. Just look at the proportion of good, wholesome stories compared to negative stories. We tend to remember and hold on to the negative more so than the positive. And that can bias us. For example, if I had a negative experience throughout the day, then I am biased in thinking, you know what, this whole day has been crappy. I was late to work. My coffee was cold that I got from the drive-through. My computer didn't work, and now I'm dealing with this. So I'm already influenced by negativity. So now that becomes a bias that I bring into an investigation. Those are the 2 most common, recency as well as negative. You also have what's called halo and double horn bias, which means the person can do no good. The double halo is this person's an angel. They could do no wrong. And so those are other examples of biases as well.
So positive or negative biases. So
yes,
having that, staying objective is very difficult since we are human beings and we do have relationships with many of these people or someone who's involved. And that's when sometimes too, bringing in a third party is really valid because you have to have someone who literally can just take an objective view and weigh the evidence only instead of, that's why we came up with a legal system that has judges in the first place, right? When they're non-biased, because you have to just at some point say, we need to lay this out and make a decision. What is it worth pursuing? Is it not worth pursuing? What is the purpose without feeling, what if the complaint is, and, as we've talked about before, I used to work in Hollywood. So what if the complaint is against the chairman of the company?
Yes.
What if it is a sexual assault complaint? Let's just use that as an awful example. But after the Me Too movement, this is something we talk about more, which is a good thing. So that is very hard. How does an HR person who gets landed with this proceed, right? This is very dangerous territory. They may have a fabulous relationship with the CEO, or they may have a terrible relationship. And how do you stay proactive in such a tenuous situation? Those are the tricky ones.
And that's why you mentioned a third party, having a third party that is completely objective. They don't have a horse in the race. They can look at, and they're not biased. They don't have that recency or negative or double halo or double horn biases, because they're going into that situation completely unbiased and only looking at the facts. And this is important when it comes into weighing the evidence. How do we determine the credibility and the relevance of different pieces of evidence? It goes back to your relationship. And that relationship contingent upon, is it more likely than not that based on what you know, that this person could have done X, Y, Z? And sometimes the truth of the matter is we honestly don't know. Because I've also seen where we have said, oh, I know John. John would not do that, only to find out not only did John do it, but John has been doing it for over the course of the last 3 months, 3 years.
I had an ex-husband like that. Oh, wait, did I say that out loud? Okay. Moving on. So let's talk about cross-referencing evidence a little bit just for a moment here. So now we have our testimonies, we have physical evidence. How do we link these and then identify the gaps?
Yeah. And what you want to do, you want to lay it out and you want to see what matches. For example, let's say going back to the illustration of John throwing the mug towards Sally, let's say in the break room. Well, do we have the mug? Yes. Do we have witnesses that saw John throw the mug? Yes. Well, now I can pair the thrown mug with John. I can place him at the location. There were witnesses that saw, and even John in his interview said, I was mad. I didn't mean to throw it. I just reacted. I didn't mean to throw it at her. I thought I was just throwing it against the wall, and I didn't mean to throw it in her direction. So you want to make sure that the evidence supports the testimony, not that the testimony support the evidence. And the reason you want to make sure the evidence supports the testimony, because there is a bias for people that tend to testify or to change their testimony to fit what the evidence. And you always want to make sure that the evidence shows this happened. Case in point, a good example is, and you ever watch some of these crime shows where they would show mug shots, right? And they'll say, didn't this person, pick out the person that you saw, and they put their finger next to the person that they really want the witness to choose.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah,
even though they didn't say anything, but guess what? It was implied by pointing.
They're leading. Yeah,
that
exactly.
They're leading that person. Oh, yeah, it was that person.
Mm-hmm.
Are you sure? And so that's why you want to make sure that if you use pictures, for example, that you lay it in front of them and maybe stand back and don't do anything with your eyes, with your finger that would suggest or lead or hint that you're guiding the person towards a specific direction. And I see that happens. Yes, go ahead.
If this kind of thing is interesting, particularly interesting to any of you, these are great subjects to read up on. The psychology of investigation. There's endless resources for that. If that's something that is not just a part of your job, you're like, I can't believe I have to do this, but it's actually like this, I could be really good at this and I want to learn more. It's a whole field of research. There's degrees in criminal law. There's so much to be investigated. So if that's interesting for you, there is literally a bottomless resources for you to dig deeper. We only have a minute left, but in that, let's just talk briefly about creating that final report. In short, what are the best practices for summarizing our findings in that clear and concise way?
Exactly. Every report should have basically 5 sections. Number 1, there should be the summary of what happened. There should be evidence that a due process meeting. Other words, I met with the person, this is what was said, they declined, they denied, or they supported. Third, consequence. Let's say they admitted to it. Well, what are the consequences of their actions? And that should be followed with the signature. And lastly, it should be dated. And so those are the 5 key elements of any type of report. A summary, there was a meeting that took place, there was expectations with consequences, sign, and date. And sometimes it's inconclusive, and you have to report. based on the evidence, we were unable to determine fault. And that's your report.
Excellent. Excellent. And we just want to thank you all for joining us here today. So we have one more in this 4-part series on conducting workplace investigations here on MetaGagement-HR, making the possible probable. And we thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to like and comment, subscribe, and join us streaming this same time next week, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. GMT for more essential HR insights. Thank you so much and stay tuned. Okay, before you go today, there's a bonus. As you've noticed, I've changed clothes because this is actually a 2-part episode today. For some of our platforms, they're going to air separately, but for you, you get 2 together today. So stay tuned. We're going to be right back with episode 4 of our 4-part series in MetaGagement, conducting workplace investigations. You're going to want to stick around for this because we're going to finally be talking about how to close the loop. How do you make the decisions that are required and communicate the outcomes as an HR professional in conducting these investigations? So stay tuned and we'll be right back.
Get ready to unlock your full potential and transform your vision into reality. Go beyond traditional employee engagement to focus on the whole person with the focused Meta Mindset system. Experience real, measurable progress towards personal and professional goals. Dr. Lyman Montgomery and Anne Scottlin provide tailored guidance and support to help you overcome obstacles and thrive. Join them for their engaging events, like the Lunch and Learn webinar series, and experience the future of employee engagement. Visit metagagement.com now to get started today.
Hey there, welcome back to HR MetaGagement. So glad you are here with us for this show and this final portion of our really fabulous series right now that we've been doing called Conducting Workplace Investigations. And these investigations are so important to a healthy HR department and how to really be proactive in your job and don't make the mistakes others have made. Learn it right from the beginning. So as always, this show, MetaGagement-HR, is about making the probable possible. I'm Anne Scottlin. I'm here with my co-host, the wonderful Dr. Lyman Montgomery. Hello, Lyman.
Hey, Anne, how are you doing? So excited about this final installment of Workplace Investigation, how we bring it all together.
Absolutely. Likewise. So, and today, closing the loop. How do we make those decisions and communicate those outcomes? And for those of our viewers and listeners, we're going to guide you through the critical final steps of an investigation. We'll cover how to make well-informed decisions. How do you document your process and how do you communicate the results in a way that maintains trust and integrity within your organization, because there can be different sides of everything, right? So let's just jump in. But before we do, please like, subscribe, copy and paste this link and shoot it to someone who would enjoy our show. And as always, check out our website and MetaGagement-HR if you have any questions for us and to see what else we offer for you. So making these final decisions in the investigation, Lyman, what's involved in reviewing the evidence and these findings? What is most important?
Yeah, you want to make sure that all the evidence, all the testimonies are considered when it comes to making your final determination, whether that is a determination of responsibility or a determination that's inconclusive. Sometimes you just don't have enough evidence to support the charge, and you have to render a decision that based on the evidence, we are unable to make a finding of responsibility. And that's okay. One of the things that I always would do when I was doing workplace investigation is I would make sure that I go through all of the testimonies, and then I would weed out those that were inconclusive. For example, let's say there's discrepancy between John's testimony and Albert's testimony. Well, I'm going to put those aside and say, okay, which ones corroborate with each other? And then the ones that have gaps, I want to deal with them separately, because I might have to go back and re-interview Or maybe they said, oh, by the way, you need to talk to James. And so I want to make sure that I create two lists, testimony that support the charge, testimonies that are inconclusive, or maybe they contradict each other. And you want to make sure you've done your due diligence, especially those that are contradictory. Why did they contradict? Or maybe it was a lapse in judgments or a lapse in memory. Maybe, for example, they got the information correct, but the date was wrong. They said it was Tuesday. It actually was a Wednesday. Okay. Well, that could easily be cleared up. Maybe they said Joan when they meant John. It could be a slip of the tongue. So you want to make sure you clear those sort of things up when you're putting together your holistic review.
And what about, I know there's legal and ethical considerations. If it's really become down to legal considerations, that probably means you have outside help involved in most cases, unless you're a very large corporation and have your own legal team. So then it comes down to these ethical considerations. How do you ensure your decision complies with standards and company policies?
Yeah, there's three things you want to make sure you do. The first thing, you want to make sure that the testimonies have been verified with a signature and a date. That's important because you don't want the person to say, well, wait a minute, that's not what I said. You also want to make sure, number two, that whenever you are considering a testimony, you can take into consideration their character. What if you got testimony from someone that has been proven to be untrustworthy or untruthful? You can discount and say, you know what, or put an asterisk by that and say, the last three testimonies you gave were inaccurate or were misleading, but there's a chance that maybe this one is correct. But you can kind of hold that with an asterisk and say, okay, this person's character is a bit shady, but I'm still going to consider the testimony, but I may have to look into that particular testimony a little deeper because of the history of being misleading, untruthful, or flat out lying. And you can consider the person's character when it comes to making a decision. The other is making sure that your investigation was done within the scope of your policies and also within the scope of the law. For example, as we mentioned in the previous podcast, you didn't lead the witness. You didn't point to a picture and say, oh, this was the person, right? Or make statements that would say, well, wasn't John there? Well, the person may not even know if John was there. And so you want to make sure that the techniques that you use, also you don't want to intimidate the witness or force a confession. For example, saying, we know you did it and you might as well come clean. And if you continue to play this game, I'm going to make sure that you're fired. Well, or making promises that you cannot uphold, such as, well, you know what? Nothing's going to happen. I just want to know the truth. Bait the person and tell them the truth. And then you say, aha. And then you end up firing the person. Well, you've already established previously by saying, listen, nothing's going to happen to you. I just want to know the truth. And they tell you the truth and you end up terminating. That again can be grounds for unethical investigation because you've tricked the person into confessing and then you turned around and terminated the person. When you say,
so you have to be careful to not find yourself dismissed by
absolutely
abuse of power, basically by leading a witness or a testimony by
coercion,
prejudicing it.
Yes, absolutely.
That makes sense. And then once you once you're secure in that, and again, hopefully you have more than one person to help that review those legal and ethical considerations with you, either whether that's internal or external legal advice or an external someone who's come in to moderate for you. Now you have to determine the appropriate action. And this is where it gets very interesting, especially when we're not talking about termination, when we're talking about disciplinary action and keeping people at their jobs, and then also putting preventative measures in place. How do we decide on disciplinary actions?
Yeah, you want to make sure that the corrective action fits the violation. For example, if a person, let's say, is tardy,
Mm-hmm.
well, you wouldn't necessarily terminate the person because it's the first time being tardy or maybe absent from work. Okay. Now, you would perhaps terminate if this is the third, fourth, or fifth time the person has been tardy within a short period of time. So you want to make sure that the corrective action fits the violation. On the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, let's say it's the extreme going back to violence or theft or dishonesty. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say, for example, the person stated on their timesheet they was at work at 8 o'clock a.m., but they show up on their Facebook post at a park, at an amusement park at 8 o'clock. Well, that's considered ghost employment. Uh, that's a very serious because that's theft of time. And
Mm-hmm.
so a person can be discharged or terminated for theft of time. And
Mm-hmm.
so again, you want to make sure that you have clearly stated policies. That's why if you notice in most corrective action, they will say uh, continued violation of this policy may result in further corrective action up to and including termination of your
Mm-hmm.
position with XYZ. That's kind of like common HR
Mm-hmm.
language that gives them a broad range that says, yes, you could be terminated, or it could result in further corrective action. Now, some companies have what they call progressive disciplinary, where they may go with a verbal warning, a written warning, a final written warning, and then termination.
Mm-hmm. So that is a helpful way to proceed. And in some cases, there is company policy and procedures for
Yes.
them. So, obviously looking into that. Uh, and then let's say that a satisfactory disciplinary measure has been made. Then what? How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we use these findings to really implement measures that prevent future
Yeah.
problems?
You want to make sure that when you write your corrective action, that in somewhere within that document should be expectations going forward and the consequences. This is perhaps the biggest frustration with management. They are very good as far as the expectation, but there are no consequences. So the person says, well, you didn't say what would happen if I continued to be late or if I continued this behavior. So you want to make
Mm-hmm.
sure there are consequences. So the person knows if you continue this behavior, there are going to be consequences for continuing to violate policy, exhibit these negative behaviors, insubordination, threatening behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what you want to make sure that you do. Now, the truth of the matter is, even with that, people still violate. And that's where you have to make it clear that it will not be tolerated and it will lead to separation of their employment.
And
And
some
the
companies
key
have gone
is,
to great extents now to really come down on this. There's a British company in the news right now that has just started implementing checks on employees to see if they're actually at their desk, because they have a basic requirement that they have to be at their desk, at the business, at the building, X number of hours a week. And they're installing software and other mechanisms to actually prove that you're
yes,
there, because people aren't showing up based on just word of mouth. They can't just take their
yeah.
word for it. So, and then people start feeling like, well, this was unfair policing. Well, but not if that's a company policy that you
Now that's a
absolutely
company
have to be
policy.
at your desk for a certain 20 hours a week, and the rest you can work from home. So, again, it's as always with everything, there's always a few people who cause challenges for everybody
Yeah.
else. It seems
And
to
think
be the
about
way of the
this,
world.
Amazon, I believe, in 2025, they're doing away with remote work for the most part. And everyone has to report back to the office because there have been abuses. Now, a lot of companies are still implementing hybrid schedules. But there are some, you have to understand, with some major companies, they have real estate and they're paying rent on these empty office buildings.
Yeah.
And so they're saying to themselves, well, wait a minute, we have these massive office buildings with no one in there, but a very limited scale. So it makes sense for them to say, hey, we need people to come back to the office. And to your point, it's easier to manage when people have one location. I can physically see that John and Lyman and Sal, they're at their desk, as opposed to, well, they should be at their monitor at home, but I don't know. They could be, have their laptop and they're at the amusement park somewhere or on vacation.
And this goes back to, business and corporate administration and decisions, which is going to vary by company. And there's so much controversy right now. There's such a huge percentage of people who do work remotely who really believe that they're more productive. And in many cases, that's even proven statistically. Yeah. But there's other kinds of businesses and certain kinds of environments where it's going to be required. So being sure that, also, in just one last note here before the note, in your hiring practices as well, make sure that those things are very clearly spelled out so you don't have to deal with it later. So you don't have to leave it ambiguous and then have someone not showing up because they assumed they didn't have to. Or, making sure that the communication is very clear from day one is the most important.
That is so important. So important.
Well, we're going to run to a quick break. Yeah, we're going to run to a quick break right now, and then we're going to wrap up with a few key points here in how to communicate those outcomes, how to document the process. So for our wrap up and for the wrap up of this entire series, which is conducting workplace investigations, stay tuned. Please like, subscribe, stick around. We'll be right back to bring you the best of the best in just a moment.
Get ready to unlock your full potential and transform your vision into reality. Go beyond traditional employee engagement to focus on the whole person with the focused Meta Mindset system. Experience real, measurable progress towards personal and professional goals. Dr. Lyman Montgomery and Scottlin provide tailored guidance and support to help you overcome obstacles and thrive. Join them for their engaging events, like the Lunch and Learn webinar series, and experience the future of employee engagement. Visit MetaGagement.com now to get started today.
All right, and welcome back to MetaGagement-HR with Dr. Lyman Montgomery and myself, Ann Scottlin, and we are closing the loop today, discussing how to make decisions, communicating outcomes, and this is the end of our 4-part series on conducting workplace investigations. We just talked quite a bit. How do you review the evidence and findings? How do you determine that appropriate action? And then how do you create preventative measures to help this not to happen again? But one of the biggest things that is often kind of hanging over the head of the HR professional is documenting the process and communicating the outcome. Just briefly, let's talk about communicating the outcome. Let's talk about transparency and employee relations.
Yes, that is so important, being transparent. If, for example, you are the investigator, you made a mistake, let them know that in the course of the investigation, we did not interview all of the individuals, let's say in the break room. That's important to know. If you didn't interview everyone, then did you do a representation? Maybe you said, what, there were 10 people in the break room, and so we just randomly chose 3 or 5. You want to put that in there. Because you don't want to have a report come out and say, well, wait a minute, no one talked to me. What do you mean you said you interviewed people in the break? I was in the break room. No one asked me. So you want to be transparent as far as the scope and the limitations of your investigation. And the reason you want to put limitation there, that speaks to the scope. For example, we only interview those that were at work on that day. If you're doing like a climate investigation where they say, what, this particular department has a reputation of discrimination. Maybe you only interview those people that were there on that day. Well, limitation is we didn't interview everybody. Another limitation could be we didn't have access to everyone because 3 of the 5 people were out on a leave of absence or vacation. And so again, whatever limitations of your investigation, want to put that in there as far as being transparent. Anything that could have changed the outcome, you want to make that known as well. Now, let me say this real quick. There's a difference between being transparent to a report that goes to leadership and transparency when it comes to the report that might be published publicly or given to those involved. And the difference being there's certain information that might be sensitive that you don't want the public to know. So sometimes if it's a public document that your policy says all investigations we put online. Well, instead of putting people's name, you might have subject A, subject B to protect their identity. Okay. You would strike like sensitive information such as, name, addresses, even gender or race, any type of what we call identifiers. Because let's say you have a company that everybody knows is 95% female. Well, it wouldn't, and you mentioned a male. Well, there's only 2 men working in the department, so by process of elimination, they can kind of figure out. So you want to make sure you remove those identifiers.
Really important to know those things and just be aware of your good practices when it comes to that.
Yes.
Also with documenting your investigation, making sure your final report, making sure those key elements are included in your final investigation report, keeping immaculate records, securely storing those records, those investigative documents for future reference. Super critical that those are protected, preserved, and as we discussed before, have limited access to only people who are supposed to be able to see them. And finally, we're talking about learning and improving. How do we go forward from this? For example, what would we do for a post-investigation review?
Yeah, you want to look at how the investigation was carried out. What did you learn from the investigation? What were some of the missteps? Every investigation will have missteps. From example, it might be, maybe I should have, asked a different set of questions than what I asked. It could be, I needed to expand the number of people that I interviewed. And again, these are all, Monday morning quarterback type of thing. The other thing is having someone else look at your report and say, hey, is there anything you see in the report that you would have done different, whether it's the questioning, the type of questions, or maybe, for example, when I was doing an investigation, one of my big takeaways was early on learning not to ask why questions, because I realized every time I asked a person why, they got defensive. So instead of asking why questions, I would ask what or how questions. For example, instead of saying, why do you think John did this? And people got defensive. Well, I don't know why John did it. I don't know. Instead, I would say, what do you think led to John getting agitated? Well, the what seemed less accusatory and less direct. Or how? Well, how do you think this played out? Well, they were in the room, they were in the argument. And so again, those are things that I learned post-investigation, not to ask why questions. The last thing that I would say about learning and improving is the more you do it, the better you get.
And that's always encouraging because especially at the front end, or if you're new, fighting through that, like this is never going to end. But yeah, experience, like everything else, getting better over time, learning to do the things as simply as we talked about in earlier episodes of this series, like asking open-ended questions, like examples you just gave us. And of course, even in the end, setting up feedback loops ongoing so that people who've been involved in that investigation can continue to communicate with you and help you enhance how you conduct future investigations as well. Well, this has been such a great series. Learning how to conduct investigations, from decision-making, documentation, communication. And we want to thank you all for being with us here in the series and actually here with us on this last episode of season 1. We're so excited to have had you along. And please always send us your questions and comments. Go to our website, leave us a message, or check out what we have to offer for you. Reach out to Dr. Lyman Montgomery or myself at any time. We would love to hear from you. And as always, please like and comment, and keep watching for additional episodes. Same time, same place, on whatever platform you're watching or listening today. Lyman, any final words today?
It's always a pleasure doing these podcasts, but also to those out there that are HR professionals and those that have HR responsibilities. We hope that these have been beneficial, relevant, and pertinent to help you do your job much better.
Amazing. And as always, Dr. Lyman Montgomery, until next time, thank you, everybody. See you then.